Okay, so Holger, thanks for joining us, and over to you, really, to give us a presentation, and look forward to questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks for having me, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, indeed, Will and myself, we've been working together for a long time. I won't say for how long, that well, that's not so good. But he introduced you obviously to the planetary boundaries, so I will keep that very, very brief, only refer very briefly to what I understand, what we understand by the planetary boundaries, and working at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research now for 1.5 years. The new director, Johan Rockström, has been the founder of this concept, and he encourages us to try and also apply it. That's what I like to talk to you about a bit, what we call operationalization of planetary boundaries, which of course is always tricky, and you will see why to some extent. And I would actually encourage discussion with you afterwards, and I try to keep it relatively short, my presentation, on what such an operationalization could look like in Australia. So let's get started. If I can, let's see. What do I need to do? Yeah, here we go. So you've seen the iconic graphs of the 9 planetary boundaries and how they radiate and how they exceed the limits. Some of them already do. They do define as what we call a safe operating space for humanity, within which humanity can thrive and well-being can be achieved for all. They are really derived from Earth system science, for which Will Steffen, Johan Rockström, and others stand. There was a predecessor called guardrails at the time for climate only, that came about more than 20 years ago in a German context, Environmental Council, that started setting these guardrails for climate, from which then others are now derived. And clearly it's a risk-based framework where you don't have sharp boundaries, but where you have increasing risks the further you move out on this graph. And of course they lobby for a precautionary approach. So they are set so that you're still having a safe distance from critical thresholds when you obey the planetary boundaries. As I said, they really started from the climate boundary, say the 2-degree target as it was, and that was extended to other environmental processes, such as those related to land, water, biodiversity, and biogeochemical cycles. The beauty is really that there is one single number setting a global target, which of course also makes the concept and the framework contested by scientists who are working in the respective area. They feel there's not enough acknowledgement of their much more detailed experience they have, and detailed studies they've done. But that way, with having such an iconic number, it becomes really a very nice communication tool beyond science also. And it's a way of scientifically informing what you may call global responsibility, which is actually something that many of the stakeholders that we work with ask for. How do we meet our global responsibilities? Can you give us quantitative information? And that's basically what the planetary boundaries are about, of course, with some weaknesses that we still experience. So in a way, you may call them a dashboard for global environmental sustainability. Now on making them work, operationalizing them, there are of course various different target audiences, starting from national and local policymakers to companies, and more recently we also start working with cities as another entity that tries to live within planetary boundaries. And it's really about bridging the gap that exists in climate science, but that also exists elsewhere in environmental sciences, of making the scientific information actionable. So what we do, we downscale, at least we try to downscale those global numbers to something that applies to a specific regional context, and we try to translate them also so that they make sense in the respective context. We call it deriving fair shares of the global safe operating space. And you may, and people actually do debate for quite some time what fair in that context means. I come back to that, and I leave it to you to judge and comment. In a way, then what you come up with is a benchmarks of for environmental performance, against which you can compare current performance or also projected future performance. I start with Europe, a study we did for the European Environmental Agency a couple of years back, Looks a bit complicated, but I'll explain briefly what the graph shows. You see along the x-axis the different planetary boundaries or the environmental compartments: climate, land, nitrogen, phosphorus, and fresh water. It's all at the European level. The red horizontal line indicates the downscaled planetary boundary per capita, and it's normalized, so it always stands at 1. That's what each of us, each of the, say, 8 billion people on Earth is entitled to, if you wish, if you do distribute or allocate global safe operating space equally per capita. And then what you see for Europe being depicted in green and blue, is that in most cases, Europe exceeds per capita that threshold, while the global exceedance is normally lower. Global per capita actual performance is shown in orange or red. And then what's quite interesting is the difference between the green and the blue bars, because blue stands what we call production-based performance, and green stands for what we call consumption-based performance. So when you only look within a country, or within Europe in that case, and you just look at CO2 emissions, land use, water use, and so on within Europe's boundaries, then you end up with the blue numbers or the blue bars. While if you look from a consumption-based perspective, which is to say all the emissions and resource uses Europe is responsible for to meet its consumptive needs for goods and services, then you end up with the green bars. It indicates that Europe is a net importer of many goods, in particular foodstuff, and with that it exports the respective environmental pressures. There is a debate about who's responsible for those pressures that occur elsewhere in the world for producing goods, food in particular for European consumption. But what you see is if you take a consumption-based perspective, Europe fares worse than if you take a purely place-based European perspective. So consumption-based perspective tells us something about externalization, and unfortunately that externalization of environmental pressures is growing. What you can see, for example, for Switzerland, they did a very detailed study on this phenomenon. They took, don't worry about the exact meaning of what is called in German here Umweltbelastung. It's an aggregate measure of environmental pressures over time from 1996 to 2011. And what you see, the internal pressures like water use, land use, is decreasing over time, while the external pressures are increasing. So there's more and more import of environmentally intensive goods and services. And as a matter of fact, at European level, the total pressures are increasing while the internal pressures are decreasing. So we're not really following what's called these Kuznets curves, where further development, economic development leads to a cleaner economy. On the contrary, our economy is getting more and more dirty, only we don't see it at home, we only export it. And just an example we did a few years back, looking at virtual water imports, so water that's been used elsewhere in other countries to produce the food that we're consuming in Germany, or in that case it was in Berlin. We did it for Berlin, and we calculated how far away is this production taking place, from where are we sourcing the water used for food production. And it turns out on average it's more than 4,000 kilometers away, due to things like soy being produced in South America, palm oil being produced in Southeast Asia, and so on and so on. So we're really sourcing from further and further away with globalization and more complex and longer supply chains. Now, when Europe is externalizing these pressures somewhere else, they must be internalized, so to say. They occur somewhere else. We just finished, or we're about to finish, a study for Ministry of Environment in New Zealand, where we looked at this effect and overall at respecting or not respecting planetary boundaries. And with New Zealand being a net exporter of foodstuff to Europe, to other places, we see an opposite effect. While, as I said before, in Europe, there is a larger consumption-based footprint usually than there is a production-based footprint. Here is, for the example of nitrogen, the New Zealand picture, where you see New Zealand's pressure consumption-based on nitrogen use per capita, and New Zealand's pressure on nitrogen use production-based. So consumption-based in that case is smaller than the production-based, simply because most of what's produced, I believe it's most, what's produced in New Zealand is going for export. And only a fraction of what's being produced, and hence a fraction of the environmental pressures is serving consumptive needs of the Kiwis themselves. So you see again the normalized planetary boundary per capita, what's the allowance for each and every one on Earth, while on world average, the world citizen is just staying within the boundary. New Zealand is exceeding it anyways, but is exceeding it more to grow all the food for feeding the world than for feeding themselves. Now that raises some questions as to who's actually responsible. I will not try to provide an answer. You can argue either way, to let the Kiwis take care of it, not to overuse land and water and overpollute with nitrogen and phosphorus and so on, or us importers to reduce our consumption and hence reduce our imports from these countries where the production takes place. Open for discussion and interpretation, of course, but the numbers are quite clear here. We did a study for Germany, also with a focus on nitrogen, where we try to make the link to actual regulation. So I'll show you playing a bit with numbers. So you see where we are heading when we downscale the nitrogen boundary, the global allowance to German level. And if we do this equal downscaling, which can be done per capita or can also be done per agricultural area, we end up with a certain number of kilograms of nitrogen that every citizen is entitled to, every Earth citizen is entitled to. Sorry, I suppose you see my emails here. And if you do the same downscaling per capita, you end up with a slightly different number because we're so densely populated, but that's what it is. And hence you can calculate for all our 80 million citizens, Germany's fair share of the global value for nitrogen boundary. You can either do it on an equal per area allocation of the global space, or you can do it on an equal per capita allocation of that space. You end up with slightly different numbers, but the point is that we're way, way above. Even if we look at a production-based performance, only looking at how much nitrogen we're emitting within Germany. If you now take this consumption-based perspective, where we also account for all the nitrogen released elsewhere in the world for our consumption, the value goes up further, and the exceedance of our fair share gets even higher. Now there's new regulation at a national level and also at European level under discussion, which is not even consumption-based. That's asking too much. It's production-based, just looking at emissions within Germany. It would bring down the level to much less that we have at the moment, but it would not be enough. That's the point here, to meet any of the consequences of downscaling the planetary boundaries. That's a perspective nobody really likes to take. That kind of global responsibility is a bit uncomfortable to take on. But eventually, in order to develop sustainably on our planet, we probably need to incorporate that in not only in our current performance, to check that against the benchmark called planetary boundaries, but also to check future allocations or future plans against that planetary boundary. And maybe just for interest, you see up there at the top that we're entitled to something like 9 kilograms per capita, each of us, each Kiwi, each Aussie, each German. But then what WHO, the World Health Organization, really recommends as per capita intake is much less. It's a third, only 3 kilograms. That's enough to keep us healthy. What that tells us is that there is a huge lever in nitrogen use efficiency too. We don't need to overspend our fair share that much if only we apply the right technologies. But there's a lot more to be said about nitrogen, the complex cycle of it, and why our farmers are dumping so much in the ground. That's a lecture by itself, I might say. Going on to allocation, what I did so far showing you was we allocate the global planetary boundary values equally per capita of area. But of course, you can debate that equal allocation. Does every citizen on Earth have that same right, or are there other possible allocation mechanisms to really distribute that global value over countries, over companies, over cities? And there are many, and we know that discussion from climate negotiations. And there's no right or wrong. It depends on your perspective. It depends on your argument, and people would use different arguments. I just want to show you when applying different principles, how also your target value then is different depending on what principle you use. I just list a few of them. It's not a complete list, but it's a relatively long list, so I go only quickly through it. So that's the one, equity considerations, which means equal per capita that I used before. You can also take into account historic emissions. If you have emitted, let's say, CO2 or greenhouse gases for a long time, there may be a historic debt that you may want to take into account when calculating future allowances. There's the so-called grandfathering principle, which basically said, I can do what I used to do. Contraction and convergence is quite well known from climate negotiations, where we all try to converge to a similar, let's say, per capita value coming from very, very different starting values. Common but differentiated responsibility is known from various particular development contexts, where you say, well, don't the poor countries have other rights than us rich countries, because they really need to come to another development level, and that may require further resource use or emissions. Capacity and ability goes in a similar direction, and so goes right to development. But you may also argue that, well, a country is entitled to what it has in terms of resource endowments, or that may be an interpretation of sovereignty principles, if you wish. And then yet another angle would be to say, well, let's reduce where it's economically most efficient, which is an argument quite often heard. And in a business context, quite often now a measure being used is, or common denominator being used is the share of total value generation that a company has, or that a sector has in the total economy. And then saying, well, depending on how much our value generation comes to, that also determines our share of emissions or resource use. Colleagues of ours in Europe, in the Dutch Environmental Protection Agency, did calculations for some of these allocation principles for the Netherlands. And as I said before, you come up with different benchmarks. Not so comfortable, but that's what science does. And then it's up to every one of us to interpret those and judge which serves us best, or which is the fairest way of doing so. So you see, first of all, a similar figure as you saw before for Europe. You see the different environmental compartments or planetary boundaries: carbon, cropland, nitrogen, phosphorus, biodiversity. And then you see again in the fat bars the actual performance. Blue is the production-based perspective, and green is the consumption-based perspective. So the Netherlands, much like Europe overall, is exerting higher pressures if you take a consumption-based perspective. And you see also the dotted black horizontal line, which is the equal per capita allocation of the planetary boundaries. That's what each Dutchman would be allowed to if we just distribute the planetary boundaries equally across all 8 billion. And you see that in most cases, no matter whether it's production-based or consumption-based perspective, Netherlands is above the dotted black line, maybe with the exception of cropland use, simply because Netherlands is so efficient in its land use. But then what's interesting is now they applied different allocation mechanisms of downscaling, for allocating the planetary boundaries. Some of those, 3 or 4 of those that I showed on the figure before. And then you end up with yet another bar, like an error bar of targets, of benchmarks, of which the dotted black line is only one, which is the equal per capita allocation. And then there are various others. And again, no matter what allocation mechanism you use, usually Netherlands is way above, but then it's becoming a moving target. What you also see there is negative values. So some of the target values become negative depending on the allocation principle that you apply. Well, what does that mean? It probably means that there has been such a historic debt. Netherlands has been overspending so much in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or release of nitrogen into the environment that it better recaptures some of that rather than emitting even more. It indicates basically that there is a need for regeneration in some way of environmental compartments. And it also is a strong signal to say, well, incremental change of doing a little better than before is simply no longer enough. You need to go to transformative change. And you will hear me over the next 10 minutes that I have left saying that more often, that transformative change will probably be necessary to stay within or return into the planetary boundaries. I go quickly to an example that's from another group of scientists, not us, who looked at or applied planetary boundaries to different cities. They didn't quite literally translate them. That's something you find in in scientific literature a few times that people take the liberty to modify the planetary boundaries a bit, which I think is okay. You want to contextualize them, but of course it brings new difficulties of consistency, comparability. But it's necessary eventually. You need to find treat that fine line of staying true to the planetary boundaries as they originate from Earth system science, but then you need to adapt them and translate them to your respective context so they become actionable. What you see is a city like Shanghai is really above most of the planetary boundaries. There is geophysical risk. That's their invention. Don't worry about it. And pollution is also their own interpretation. But other than that, Shanghai is in the orange to red sector almost everywhere, and so are some of the other countries, in particular those that have high footprints in the developed world, like Toronto. You can see poorer countries, poorer cities, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, per capita are staying more within their planetary boundaries still, but of course they are growing fast and they're trying to catch up with developed country cities. So if you take the trajectory forward into the future, you easily will end up at similar footprints and similar transgressions of planetary boundaries as we already see today for cities like take Vienna, Brisbane, Shanghai for that matter. And the question again is how to develop and to return into the safe operating space. My vague response then is some transformation. The city of Amsterdam this year published a similar report where they also looked at social boundaries. So you heard about the Doughnut before. That was actually done in collaboration with Kate Raworth Institute to look at that trade-off between staying within planetary boundaries, but at the same time providing a livable place and well-being for everyone. It's just to say that Amsterdam is no different from the other cities that we saw before. It's only a different way of calculating that overshoot. Now, last point is to try and apply planetary boundaries also to private sector, to companies and sectors, economic sectors, which is only just beginning. So what I'm showing here is more plans than real work. There is a whole network called Science-Based Targets Network tackling that task over the next couple of years. It started from something called Science-Based Targets Initiative, which only looks at climate and which advises companies on how to stay within the climate boundary, 2 degree or 1.5 degree limit. And that is now taken further to the other planetary boundaries through the Science-Based Target Network. A few principal steps I can show you, but as I said before, there are only a few companies who have embarked so far on that journey, and it's early work. So you do some geographical scaling, you translate planetary boundaries to the appropriate scales that matter for your respective business or sector. It could be like an ecoregion if you want to look at your biodiversity, performance, planetary boundary, or if you a watershed, if you want to look at your water boundary performance. Then of course you need to prioritize. You need to find where are your critical emissions or critical resource uses. Which are they and where are they along the supply chains? All those allocation mechanisms that you saw before, you need to choose from and decide which one works best for you and for your company. And as I said, you end up with different results depending on which one you choose. And then you try to make these targets actionable. So you associate them with your actual company context, your specific activities in your company and how you can address that respective boundary, whether it's through reducing pollution, or whether it's through avoiding land conversion or through restoration. So you have to really work out the cause-effect relationships specifically for your company. I'm a fan of sector-based approaches. If you take a sector like paper, automobile, food, whatsoever, then you can address a larger set of companies and you can work with similar principles. So that, to my mind, is a good way forward. And again, you look for specific contexts in which the respective sector or company works. For example, if you look at landscapes, you look at biodiversity, you look at the specific vulnerabilities or also historic contributions to degradation of the sector. In different geographical contexts, you you deal with different biomes or ecoregions, which have different levels of planetary boundary exceedance. This is more for illustration than for real. It's on 3 different types of ecoregions: Atlantic forest in South America, rangelands in Southern Africa, and wetlands in Southeast Asia. And they're depicted here at different levels of that green, orange, red color coding. That you also need to determine when you look at your supply chains and you find where your products come from. Then you need to apply these criticalities, and you need to think about actionable solutions. As I said before, they can be reducing impact, they can be conservation measures, regeneration, restoration, and eventually transformation, all of which companies sooner or later will need to tackle in order to return back to their respective fair shares. So what's currently under development in a science-based targets network, as I said, it will take another 2 years or so as a draft guidance. No need to go into detail, it will probably change, but the steps are quite clear. So first of all, you have to do in step 1 what they call a materiality assessment. You look at what are your critical emissions and resource uses. You map your value chains to get a geographically explicit picture of where these things happen. You set your target boundary, you select your target boundaries, the most relevant ones for you, and you prioritize them. Step 3 would be setting baselines of where are you at the moment, and then setting your targets in order to next step 4, then act to do these measures that I said before: reduce your impacts, regenerate, restore, eventually transform. And lastly, of course, you will need to evaluate and monitor how well you're doing over time. I think that's enough. I have some more general principles, but they don't apply so specifically to planetary boundary operationalization. So if it's okay with you, I would leave it at this and rather open for discussion, and also ask you to creatively think about what all this could mean in an Australian context, either countrywide context or particular state context, or maybe also private sector or city context if you wish. Thanks.
Thank you, Holger. That was a tantalizing taste of all of the work that you're involved with, and much of it I would like to read a lot more about. There's some questions from folks in our chat box, so I will read some of them out. Ruth has asked, what data do you use in your studies, and how do you choose which metrics or measures to use? Do you stay closely with the planetary boundaries as outlined in the initial framework, or do you use other indicators?
Yes, thank you. So I don't see the chat box at the moment. I may work my way into it over time. Oh no, okay. I see it. No, I see it. But no, let me respond. Yes, thanks for that question. Well, there is no one answer to, well, there's an answer to what data we use, but there's probably no answer to what's the right data to use. And there is, again, a consistency issue, of course, because if you look globally, which you have to in case of a consumption-based approach, you will have to rely on global data. And there are lots of inconsistencies between existing global databases and national databases. There are inconsistencies between different national databases. What we do usually is we go back to national statistical offices, like Statistics New Zealand in the most recent case, or Eurostat in the European case. And then what we do to calculate consumption-based footprints, we use what's called multi-regional input-output models, which really trace all flows. First of all, financial flows, they are translated into flows of goods and services. And then to that matrix between countries and sectors, there's an associated matrix of environmental pressures that go with them. So that's how we calculate what a consumption of a certain food item here in Germany causes in terms of environmental impacts elsewhere. There are many difficulties because if you want to be comprehensive, all-inclusive in terms of all these fluxes, you have to aggregate to quite high level in terms of sectors and product categories. So you will not be able to specify one single product, an apple from New Zealand, but you may end up with a much more aggregate category that may be called fruits, or that may even be called food items only, depending on which MRAO model you use. We try to stick to the planetary boundaries as closely as we can. And I said before that some other groups are interpreting the planetary boundaries more leisurely than we do. Having said that, I should also respond by saying that planetary boundaries are still under development. And that was the challenge that Johan Rockström set in and his team set in the beginning. They put out these initial planetary boundaries with explicit request to question and further develop and refine each of the planetary boundaries. And that's what's currently happening. Each planetary boundary has a number of research groups looking more closely, examining them and revising them also as scientific advancement allows that. So they are not cast in concrete. They did change from the first version that was published in 2009 by Rockström et al. To the second version published by Will Steffen et al. In 2015, and they are still under development. There is a strong debate, for example, about the nitrogen boundary, whether this is a useful boundary as it stands, or whether it's simply completely out of synchrony with the needs for feeding the world population. At our own institute at PIC, there is some more detailed work going on about the water boundary, whether this is such a useful boundary for guiding water-related action, or whether we probably need to look more closely per watershed in order to secure environmental flows. So there's a lot of development going on in the planetary boundaries, each of them, and hence we do try to adapt there as well.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Jack. It's just in two parts. Let me just, a lot of the overshoot of consumption footprint in the developed world would be accounted for in the production intensiveness per capita in the developed world. Is that a fair analysis? But then I think he says, correction, would it be accounted for in the production per capita of the developing world? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no. That's more or less what I said before. In particular, the developed world or the industrialized countries, or whatever the politically correct term may be these days, they are having much higher per capita footprints usually, with some specification that says we also have a huge spread within countries between the rich and the poor, and the same happens in poorer countries where the upcoming middle class is also very intensively consuming. But overall, yes, it's true that we are having much higher footprints per capita, sometimes 10 times higher, sometimes even more when you look at greenhouse gas emissions per capita than a poor country has. And we are, as I said before, externalizing a lot of it. And indeed, we're externalizing a lot of that pressure, sourcing from poorer countries, because we're sourcing a lot of raw materials that are produced either only in the tropics or more cheaply in developing countries. So that makes the distinction between production and consumption-based calculation of our footprints. And that means also a different type of transgression of our fair shares, depending on whether we look production or consumption-based. I tried to indicate in one of the slides that I don't have a very clear answer who's responsible. What you usually have is lengthy and complex supply chains, often with several steps of processing that take place in different countries, so they can really be very complex. And in each step, from the primary production through all steps all the way to final consumption, you have some environmental pressures occurring. I guess it's fair to say that we should act at all levels. We should try to reduce our footprints wherever possible. There is a different question, though, as to who's responsible. I would think that we can take a lot more responsibility in the developed countries than we do at the moment, but that doesn't relieve the developing countries from their responsibilities as well. Just thinking of the example of Brazil, where we are sourcing so much soy from, it's fair to say that we need to change our diets and our dependency on feed, soy for feed for our livestock. But then again, that doesn't mean that the Brazilian government can do whatever they want with their rainforests. So it's really a shared responsibility, I would say. Hope that was a kind of response to the question.
No, that was good. Thank you, Holger. And it's not so much a question as, well, I guess it's a short one from me. Would you say that the contraction and convergence model, which I'm familiar with from climate change, is one of the fairer ways of trying to bring per capita consumption in alignment across different countries and across different spaces, or was that too general a question?
Well, I'm a bit hesitant to give a clear answer here, because there are really very different interpretations of what fair means.
Yes.
But my sense is indeed that something that in the end comes to somewhat similar allowances per capita, no matter where you live and how wealthy you are or what your specific context is, comes closest to my understanding of fairness. I would go that far. Whether the pathway, and in particular in climate, the pathway matters a lot. And some of the other planetary boundaries, the pathway is not quite so important because of for example, because of a lower memory effect. Atmosphere has a high memory effect. Some of the other environmental effects are not quite as long lasting. Whether the pathway has to be that contraction and convergence one, or whether you may want to allow some of the poor countries some overshoot, or whether the opposite way, you argue that the poor countries that are still behaving well and environmental footprints should rather leapfrog and should not even converge to the same level that we have at a given moment, but should really transform so that their footprints are radically lower due to new technologies, different consumption and production patterns whatsoever. That's a difficult question. I don't really want to provide a definite answer there.
No, that's fair enough. Thank you. There's another question from John. He says, thank you, Holger, for this informative presentation. A couple of questions. Which companies are leading the way in planetary boundary downscaling for their own operation? Are there any available published case studies to date? And are there any sectors where you're seeing particular interest in this work? What do you think are the motive of companies to engage in this work? That's a lot of questions, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll start from, no, don't worry. I'll start from the end.
Yes.
Companies seem to have quite different motivations. I mean, after all, companies are led by people, and people are different depending on their upbringing and so on. We do find in some companies a real wish to preserve the environment, let's say, for future generations, just like you find with people of all walks of life everywhere. So that may be enough as a motivation in some cases. But then, of course, there's always a need to remain profitable, to reduce reputational risks that may easily occur if you spill or if you destroy. There is an increasing argument with many companies, at least here in Europe. I don't know what that looks like in Australia, that they have difficulties in recruiting new staff, knowledgeable and excellent staff, and that the requirements that those excellent people pose may have to do with working conditions, but may also have to do with a sense of their work, the motivation for their work. So they may no longer be happy to be hired just to increase profits, but they may wish to work for a company that behaves in a sustainable way. So there are various motivations why they embark. And I guess increasingly they see, I mean, for climate, it's so obvious nowadays that nobody can stay outside of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Everyone has to contribute. In other cases, it's not quite so obvious. And it's, I must admit, it's sometimes also more difficult to translate the other planetary boundaries to company action. Sectors, well, I don't think there's any particular sector that sticks out, but we work a lot with the food sector, we work with the textile sector. My colleagues in Stockholm at the moment work with the beauty sector, why not? What distinguishes sectors somewhat is the difficulty to measure their footprints and hence their performance relative to planetary boundaries because of the difference in supply chains. If you take the example of some simple food product versus a car, automobile, you easily see that it's so much more complex to assemble a car with all the parts that come from different places that are pre-processed for, let's say, for machinery or for other more complex or high-tech instruments. It's simply more difficult to fully monitor your supply chains. You can more easily affect your operations in your own plant. That's doable, but then going through all supply chains becomes increasingly difficult. That's not to say that they don't try, but it's simply a bigger task for them to make sure that all of their operations, including all the supplies and all the tiers of suppliers, behave within those limits. I'm also hesitant to highlight any particular company. You probably know that Unilever is leading in terms of sustainable, I wouldn't say they're a leader in sustainability, but they're doing a lot, including also working with the Science-Based Target Network, for example. But there are many others. I don't really want to highlight them. There is a study, and you may want to share my email later on, and then I can dig out for you a study that was done for a company that sells dairy products here in Europe. They're called Alpro. I think they're Dutch, and they're now part of Danone. They have done quite an intensive, detailed study, or they have commissioned quite a detailed study on their sourcing and how it relates to context-specifically downscale planetary boundaries. That has been published. But I should also say it's not conclusive. It's not like now they exactly know the numbers and now they can act and just fulfill that requirement. It all is early in the development, and so it's that study from Alpro is also more designing the way a company goes to eventually meet their requirements in terms of planetary boundaries. So that's one that comes to my mind. I must say I'm not aware of any studies been published so far that you could look at other than that one.
Okay, thank you, excellent. Tammy is asking, have there been any Australian cities, excuse me, analysed in the way that you've outlined some of these city assessments?
Not that I'm aware of. And there haven't really been many cities really working themselves on it. What's been done a lot, again, is working on climate targets. There is the C40 Cities Network. I suppose there must be an Australian city within that one. But they have limited themselves to translating the climate boundary or the climate target, if you wish, leave outside the planetary boundaries so far, to their respective cities. Again, send me an email, I will have a look, but I doubt that I will find an Australian city.
No, I think we would have heard of it with great jubilation. In our research, we haven't even found much application of the Global Footprint Network, which the footprint methodology, which has been out since the early 90s. You know, there hasn't been a lot of revolutionary uptake of whether it's material flows or footprinting or now planetary boundaries analysis. But
maybe worthwhile to mention, since you're asking, yes, I share your sense there. I showed before one graph from our recent work, actually, which happened mostly this year on New Zealand, and the New Zealand Ministry of Environment was asking us whether we could also do a sub-study on, what was it, I think Hawke's Bay area or something. And we were quite hesitant. I should also say that, because that was a relatively small area with a relatively small population. And the stretch becomes more and more difficult the smaller the unit is that you look at to relate it back to those global numbers.
Yes.
It's not impossible, and I think it should be done in some way. Again, as I tried to show, there is no straightforward way of doing it, but eventually there is this need to take on global responsibility by any entity of any size, and by bringing together those relevant local sustainability criteria of any small town or city or region in a country with those global targets, much like what's been done with the climate target. Everyone can contribute and everyone must contribute. But again, it's more difficult with the other planetary boundaries, and hence there is no easy way. We don't pretend that there is this easy cookbook. You just, here you are, here's the guidance, and you know what you need to do to stay within the planetary boundaries if you're a small town. So it's, it may be to some extent ignorance on planetary boundaries by the respective entity, but we should also be fair and say that science cannot deliver that, that guideline easily to entities of any size. That's simply not there.
Mm. Thank you. Certainly in our work here in Australia, it's also a case of no one's had to do it before, so they're just grappling with how to do it now. So it's a very new area for many groups. Yeah. We will get there. There's another question. Janet has asked if you could please go back in your slides to the slide that looks at different principles of operational planetary boundaries. I think that might be the ones with the different frameworks. That one? Different principles, yep. I think that might be, Janet, I don't know if you've got a follow-up question or whether you just wanted to read that again, but I'm sure Holger will send me his slides and I can share. Yeah,
sure.
We'd love to share them with our participants. Thank you. While Janet and others are reading that slide again, I might move to the next question. Whoop, my questions are going all over the place.
I'm glad that you're choosing. I didn't even open the chat box.
No, and you shouldn't have to. You should relax. You're our guest. Okay, so Andrew is asking, is the allocation of, if the allocation of fair share is left to the participants, then perhaps they won't add up at the end to a complied solution. How can everyone be held to account, or is this just a first step in the right direction? He says the Paris Agreement NDCs are an example.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. So yeah, why not starting from that end? Yes, the NDCs, they are, if you wish, they are a response to that difficulty of coming up with a agreed upon solution imposed in a top-down manner. That simply didn't work for the last 25 years or so. Now the hope is that by bottom-up commitments, eventually they will, by starting from bottom-up commitments, eventually they will end up meeting the required global climate target. That's a hope. We'll see where we go. And it's no easier, but when looking at the other planetary boundaries. So yes, indeed, that is what you may call a process within which we create awareness, within which we provide some scientific information which helps for orientation. But it's by no means prescriptive. It's not even a complete guidance, as I was trying to explain before. So there are lots of inconsistencies. One might argue that by giving that freedom to every actor that they have anyways, I mean, who are we to prescribe anything, giving them that freedom to choose the allocation principle they wish to, we hopefully generate motivation. I mean, if I exaggerate a bit, you may say, well, let everyone pick the principle they like best, which motivates them most to take action. Then we're making some level of progress. But indeed, there is no guarantee. There's rather a certainty that we will not easily reach the needed global target. But again, it's certainly beyond science to tell what is the right or wrong principle. The planetary boundaries from the moment they were born had a strong normative element by saying, well, much like climate again, what's an acceptable risk? The acceptable risk of not transgressing a boundary that leads to unwanted effects all the way to tipping points. That is not something that you just leave to scientists to answer in a definite way, but it's it does require that process or dialogue, if you wish, with all actors, with all decision makers. There's no way around. And in that sense, I'm quite happy to provide such a, well, in Sweden they say smörgåsbord, such a broad range of possible entry points and mechanisms. Hopefully there will be some kind of consolidation towards one or a few principles that are mostly agreed upon in the end. But that's sometime in the future, I'd say.
Mm, thank you. Another question, and if Tammy doesn't mind, I'll shorten it a little. She's asking, is the donut realm achievable? If we take a per capita basis of the planetary boundaries concept, does the per capita amount meet the planetary boundary, or would we still be an overshoot? Are there any studies that examine how to reduce production and consumption to remain below overshoot, but also ensure human well-being?
Yeah, well, you may ask me, but you may ask someone else who has a different response. My sense is that yes, it is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible. There was a very recent study of colleagues of mine from PIC who tried to show that with different measures you take, you can bend the curve, so to stay within planetary boundaries while meeting the socioeconomic needs of feeding everyone and all these human securities. Again, I'm happy to send you that, but that's not by no means is that the ultimate answer to your question. There was a study by, again, the Dutch Environment Agency, PBL, something like the way forward after Rio. I can also dig that out and share that with you, where they more or less asked that same question, not so specifically for the planetary boundaries, but that was even before, it wasn't before the planetary boundaries, but it was a few years back. And the key conclusion there was to bring everyone on Earth up to a minimum level of well-being, being well-fed, having sustainable energy, and all these things doesn't require much. It's not really the bringing the poorest of the poor or those that suffer up to a decent living standard that increases our resource consumption and our emissions so much. It's really the overconsumption at the other end that pushes that strains the planetary boundaries, let's say. I found that quite convincing. That was also model-based. They're using mostly their image model, integrated assessment model for these kind of analyses. I like to believe that this is a fair representation of the situation that, and in a way it's confirmed, I would say, by that huge difference in footprints that the poor and the rich have, which says it's not really so that by bringing everyone up to a decent level, you have to increase the global footprint radically.
Do you recall what that actual study was, if you know the name of it?
I'll find it for you.
Okay,
Way
awesome.
Forward After Rio or something like that. Detlef van Voeren was the lead author, but send me an email, I'll find it for you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Tammy. And I should just add too that really a lot of the work around the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, degrowth, the degrowth movements, circular economy, the New Economy Network, all of these groups, I was going to say the scale matters because the localization movements are looking at how production and consumption, the supply chains or the production chains can be reduced so that you've got a localized scale of production that is within the productive capacity of the local ecosystems. So there's already, and even all of the work done by Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth, all of these ideas challenging the growth paradigm and rethinking what an economic framework looks like, as well as voluntary simplicity. We've got strong movements in Australia. There's been a lot of work that looks at, can we still have human beings, you know, happy, healthy, etc., and reduce consumption and production? And pretty much everything indicates yes. And Tammy, do shoot me an email. I did my PhD on regulating consumption and reducing consumption. And there's a ton of material after the Second World War showing that hyper-capitalism was deliberately created for the benefit of a small group of corporations. So you can definitely reduce consumption without affecting the actual well-being of a lot of people.
Maybe just adding a sentence of something that you all know very well, but it, I would say it fits to that particular question also, which is to say, there is this one measure that will have enormous impact on almost all planetary boundaries if it's taken, which is dietary changes, and more specifically the huge impacts that livestock products have. And you all know that on greenhouse gas emissions, water use, land use, nitrogen emissions, and so on and so on. There have been numerous studies of how strong the effect of dietary changes at large scale, meaning of everyone, so to say, and in particular of the richer ones, would be. So that's I would say that's confirming what you're saying, that we have a lot of leeway to
yes.
act.
And we have to handle these questions a lot in the work that we're interested in, because everyone says, how can you still have a happy humanity if you've got a healthy ecology? And it's, well, actually, how much should human beings demand from the living world? And what do we actually think our so-called material standard of living should be? So it's exactly what you said, Holger. A lot of it's actually decreasing the overproduction and consumption of the small percentage of people who are in abundance, materially speaking. But anyway, one time probably for one more question. Sophia has asked, with countries such as China, India, the USA, contributing more to EU, contributing more to climate change than other developing nations, are there examples of companies and cities or movements from these areas that have been able to lead the way in terms of bringing the gap down to stay within their fair share? So I think this comes back to some of the other discussion, but
what I can probably do without preempting anything in terms of the process that the Science Based Targets Network is undertaking is sharing with you the names of companies that have embarked on that journey. So you just get an impression of what that assembly of companies looks like.
fabulous.
And again, it's not to claim that they have taken all the necessary actions. It's simply not true. But they do recognize that need to base their future actions on scientific evidence and to drastically reduce their footprints and actually to also reverse, which is to say not only reduce, but then also restore and regenerate and eventually transform. So there is a set of companies that have committed, I would say, on whatever that commitment eventually means. But those names I would check quickly, but I think they can be shared. So again, that's something, if you send me that email, I try to respond by adding such a list of companies.
Also, Holger, if you're able to send me through anything you've jotted down, I'll share it on our website. Any lists of references or studies,
Yep.
Our website is going to be the place where we share all the recordings and the data and the reports that people share. So thank you very much. I think we might start to wrap it up there so that Holger can go about his day and we can go about our night. But unless there's any more burning questions, there's a couple more that came in through the private chat, but they've actually, I think, have been touched on by some of our previous answers. So perhaps everyone could join me in a strange long distance air clap. So thank you so much, Holger.
Thank you very much for staying on lines for so long.
No, it's very important work. And I must say that I hope we can stay in touch with the work that we're progressing, which brings grassroots action and connects it up to the work that's downscaling from Planetary Boundaries. So I'll be in touch and with no doubt many questions and others maybe as well. So
maybe I use the opportunity for one last sentence here, which is a bit selfish, I might say, but we tried in New Zealand to no avail, I must admit, to identify a few enlightened individuals, either in ministries, authorities, or companies that are looking for these kind of science decision-making, policy-making collaborations. I would be very interested to also start developing such a dialogue in Australia. Just to say, if you know of any individuals or organizations or companies or states or cities that might be interested, why not sending me those names? I'm not particularly focusing on Australia. I don't want to pretend I do, but I would like to develop those dialogues wherever possible and wherever there is an opportunity. So in that sense, if you have any names in mind, just send them to me. I'd be more than happy to follow up.
Thank you, Holger. It's very generous. And also, I'm in touch with some folks who are connected to very large-scale production and consumption companies who operate in Australia. And they've been very interested in our little Greenprints approach, which is helping at the bioregional scale to really understand what's going on and to connect into the global scale. So as our discussions with that large group of very large manufacturers, they're both global and national, progress, I would actually love to engage with you some further conversations. Because the companies themselves are interested in our approach, but they can see that they have to step into a slightly different realm than community groups or local councils. But yeah, fantastic. All right, so Holger, we will say thank you. You're obviously welcome. I'm just going to do a 5 to 8 minute wrap up and let everyone jump off. But thank you so much. I might just jump in and take the share screen off you, but if you could also your slides, fantastic. I'd love to share them. Thank you so much. Just very quickly, for everybody else, what I wanted to say was a huge thank you, and just do a bit of a reminder. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is already linking to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Planetary Boundaries concepts, and a whole range of pieces of work to link into this project that we're working on that is aiming to help at the bioregional level, aiming to have both the steps that people can take at all different aspects or players in a society, but also the kinds of outputs that will help us as ordinary human beings in our local place connect with country, care for country, but also be good global citizens. So I wanted to just recap on the fact that AELA is working across a whole range of different areas. And for some of the folks on this call, we would really welcome connecting with you if you're already doing research that you think might be of interest to us, or if you'd like to connect with some of our work because you're interested. We're a small not-for-profit run entirely by volunteers, which is quite unusual this day and age. But we're very passionate about bringing together a whole range, a very vast range of different approaches into a more sensible pathway so that we can take our connection to place and our relationship with the living world that Ross spoke about so beautifully, and Will Steffen spoke about, this relationship as earthlings with the local place and the planet that sustains us, and using this approach as a starting point to ask the kinds of questions that brings people into really questioning our entire industrial scale civilization and re-engaging with the simpler steps of how we do that. And I just wanted to quickly move through. Ross Williams and I are also co-directors with others on Future Dreaming Australia, which is an organisation that shares ecological knowledge across the different cultural ways of thinking and doing and being. And we run workshops about caring for country. And Future Dreaming is connected very deeply into the Greenprints approach, so that everything we do in Australia doesn't replicate colonisation, but works in a pluralism approach where non-Indigenous people can engage with place because they love it, engage with our own culture and some of the flaws within our economic and political systems, but also engage with our Aboriginal friends and colleagues in a productive, genuine partnership. And other than that, I just wanted to leave you all with a blue-banded bee, which is one of the, this is not my photo, although I do have many photos. Blue-banded bee is one of the amazing evolutionary companions that has evolved on this planet with us, and that I'm proud to call my neighbour. Little fellas live in my garden like little magical fairies, and that's my way of not just saying an acknowledgement and welcome to country at the beginning, but to acknowledge country and plants and animals at the end of a really lovely workshop and a really amazing set of speakers and conversations. And also want to share with you our main website is earthlaws.org.au. And if you've got any emails, questions, comments, articles to share, cool ideas to generate, please email us at greenprints@earthlaws.org.au. And our Greenprints website is in the process of being updated to reflect some of the truly remarkable people we're connecting with and the incredible cutting edge work that so many terrific folks are bringing into AELA. So on that note, that was my little plug for AELA. Please do stay in touch. Thank you so much, everybody. I am so impressed you've made it through the whole day glued to Zoom. I can't thank you enough for sharing this journey with us. And if we are lucky enough, thank you, little air pump there, Ian. We may also see you tomorrow afternoon. Just a reminder, we have Will Steffen's masterclass from 2 to 5 and Gethin Morgan's masterclass from 9:30 a.m. till about 12:30 on Friday. You can find the booking for those masterclasses on the very same page on Humanitics that you found us here, or jump on our Facebook page. So without any further ado, I shall release you all back into the wild, and we're having lots of lovely goodbyes and thank yous. People saying thank you to AELA, and thank you Ross, and thank you Ian, and all the other speakers who might still be on the call. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I feel really happy. We'll see again very soon. Thank you.